Welcome to Season 7 of the Institute's Child Welfare Podcast, where we delve into the efforts of child welfare leaders as they explore innovative strategies to support system-impacted parents and caregivers. You'll hear about how these individuals have navigated through challenges, celebrated triumphs, and uncovered invaluable lessons along the way. So today we're joined by Dr. Vivian Mills. Dr. Mills serves as the Assistant Director of Professional Development and Worker Wellbeing Research and Evaluation at the Florida Institute for Child Welfare. Drawing inspiration from her roles as a foster and adoptive parent, Dr. Mills is committed to effecting positive change in child welfare policy, aspiring to contribute valuable insights to support families within the system. Thanks so much for being here today, Vivian.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
We also have Dr. Taylor Dowdy Hazlett. Dr. Dowdy Hazlett is an assistant professor at the University of Kentucky College of Social Work. Taylor has over 10 years of experience in practice and research in child welfare, and her research focuses on youth and out-of-home care and improving the foster care system. Thanks so much for being here today, Taylor.
I'm so excited. Thank you for having me.
So I'm excited to dive into the research with you both, but first I'd like to hear from each of you about why you got into this line of research. So Taylor, let's start with you.
I had many years of practice experience, so I had begun my work in social work in residential group care for youth, and I then transitioned to working for Child Protective Services and went back to residential group care, and then finally ended my practice work doing clinical work with youth who were in foster care. And it was in those experiences that I really saw deficits in the system, more so with foster parent turnover and placement disruption. And in talking with foster parents that I was working with, they cited the issue being with children's behaviors. And if we dive more into that, we can understand that children's behaviors are really trauma symptoms, and the disruption and turnover are symptoms of a larger issue around lack of support, resources, and training for foster parents. I wanted to find solutions for youth to have positive outcomes after entering foster care. I had questions and I wanted to find solutions to those.
Thank you so much. And how about you, Vivian?
So as you mentioned, I'm a former foster parent, and in working with foster parents and youth, I similarly with Taylor just found that there were gaps in the system that were supportive of families. I decided, I wanted to go back to school, and I started with my master's. And during my internship, I found that I really fell in love with research and policy work, and was told that the best route would be to get a PhD. And that wasn't my intentional goal, but really my heart is to figure out how we can create policies that are beneficial to families, that help them and support families so that their outcomes are better. And I think that in doing so, we can decrease the number of children in care and hopefully keep families intact.
So Taylor, let's start with you. A couple of years ago, you completed your doctoral dissertation on foster parent training and retention. Could you tell us a little bit about that study and what you found?
So that study was a cross-sectional survey with 363 foster parents, and they were recruited through licensing agencies and Facebook support groups in 6 different states. And the majority of that sample came from Florida. What I was trying to understand is if we have this population of foster parents, are there subgroups within that population that are different from one another? And based on that, I found that there are, in fact, in this study, 3 different subgroups of foster parents based on shared responses to parenting stress, burnout, secondary traumatic stress, coping style, training, and satisfaction with the system. The first group that I found was the resourceful foster parents, and I had named them the resourceful foster parents because they had low scores on parenting stress, burnout, secondary traumatic stress. They had low scores related to how they felt about their training, so they did not find that their training was as useful as the other 2 groups. However, they had higher satisfaction within the system, and they had higher coping abilities. Then there was a second group that I found, which I subsequently named the disadvantaged foster parents because they were the complete opposite of that of the resourceful foster parents. So they had high parenting stress, high burnout scores, secondary traumatic stress. They felt, though, that training was very useful to them, but they were also very dissatisfied with the system. in the support services that they were getting from the system. And then there was this third group that kind of situated themselves right in the middle of the resourceful and disadvantaged foster parents. And those in the disadvantaged foster parent group had also rated the youth in their home as having higher behavioral problems than those in the strained and the resourceful foster parent group. So you tend to wonder if they're having higher burnout and secondary traumatic stress scores, higher parenting stress because of the issues that they were facing in their home with the youth there. Those in the disadvantaged and the strained foster parent group also had higher intent to turn over, as well as higher intentions to disrupt placement compared to that of the resourceful foster parent group that was faring much better.
Thank you so much, Taylor. When Taylor was completing this work, the Institute was at a place where we were heavily focused on our workforce-related mandates, which is something I'd like to circle back to later. But for historical context, Taylor had just completed her dissertation, and then we had Drs. Hyunji Lee and Michael Henson lead an evaluation of Florida's approach to life skills development among transition-age youth, which is a caregiver-centric model. They found that caregivers weren't receiving the support needed to fulfill this part of their role, and it was becoming clear that perhaps this was an area of research we could continue to develop. So Dr. Lee began working on a more in-depth survey of foster parents to help us understand their support needs more holistically. And when Hyenji left the Institute, Vivian, you assumed leadership of this project. So can you tell me why you were invested in seeing this project come to fruition?
It definitely was twofold, right? So as a former foster parent, I have the lived experience of understanding what training is available, what it feels like to have kids in your home that had higher behavioral needs, and what was required of us as far as preparing children who were, aging out or transitioning back home. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it was when I first initially wanted to foster, my goal was to foster youth who are aging out. And so even though that didn't actually work out the way life, kind of sets itself up, it still is an age group that I find that has just really a lack of support. I really believe that as much as we try to make life for children in foster care normal, it is not normal to be in foster care, no matter what we do. However, how many resources we provide children and the best we can do, it's just not normal. And so I think for youth who are aging out, that's a really hard time. And so I was really interested to know what was going on currently in Florida as far as providing support for foster parents to support these youth and what they felt they needed more of that we could potentially provide more resources into.
Fantastic. And understanding that the final report is currently in development, can you share any preliminary findings with us?
Sure. So we reached out to foster parents at the annual conference that they have in the summer. And so we were able to ask many different questions surrounding training. So what I will say is that currently what I've seen is that not every foster parent we surveyed had youth that were aging out or in that age group of independent living. So about half of the foster parents could not really respond to the independent living aspect of it. So for the half that either had children in their home currently at that 14 and up age or have had youth come through their home, many of them didn't even know if they had training in independent living, right? Which doesn't surprise me, but that was the current response, was that they weren't even sure if they had the training for it. And for those who did have training, they just felt like it wasn't enough, right? They weren't prepared for how do you train or prepare a youth that will age out of your home, especially if they come in later, right? So if you had a child in your home that was younger and had lived in your home, it's probably easier to transition these kind of tidbits of knowledge to children, right? Because it's kind of the everyday growing and living, and they kind of learn that, as you go. But if you have a youth that comes in your home for the first time and they're 14, 15, or 16 or older, you're not quite sure what they have learned and what they need, right? And so many of the foster parents that responded to these questions just felt like they didn't have resources. They didn't know what to draw from as far as knowledge, and they didn't feel like they had support in this area. So we're definitely still lacking in providing foster parents adequate training in supporting our youth aging out. As a whole, foster parents felt that they needed more continual training. So we were able to see that responses for foster parents who've been in the process for a while, they felt like they needed more training as far as trauma, right? What happens when children have been through trauma, what it's like to respond to youth with trauma, like especially if the trauma happened earlier on and now their behaviors were kind of responding to that a little bit later. And then they felt that for newer foster parents, they needed more training as far as systematic issues, like how does court work? What are the processes to acquire WIC if you have a child in your home ages 0 to 5? How to obtain childcare? Those are kind of things that they didn't feel like they got in their initial training. So lots of different outcomes as far as what foster parents really wanted, but still an overall trend of that there is not enough training.
It's so interesting as you're talking, you mentioned that these youth are not necessarily getting the tidbits of information that they need, that we're hoping are going to make them successful. And it feels like it's this behind the scenes knowledge. We talked about this with Nathan Scott and Dr. Kathy Moore about Parents for Parents, right? Similar for parents. So we're seeing the same pattern sort of replicated with youth, with parents, with foster parents. There's these unwritten rules or connections they need to make, or as you put it, tidbits of information that they need to be successful. And it doesn't seem like they're consistently getting it. So I found that just very interesting that you said that about the youth, but it sounds like the foster parents are experiencing the same lack of those sort of tangible things that they need to do to help support the youth that are in their care.
Right. It almost feels like we need to manualize parenting in a way, right? Because the things we teach our children, right? If you think about children who aren't in the system and they're growing up, it's not like there's a checklist that we say, okay, we got to make sure. It's like the things you teach on a day to day and it's underlying and it's just within life. So I think, like I said, for foster youth and foster parents, it's not a normal thing because it's not this continual process, right? Kids have been in and out of homes, foster parent getting children of different ages from different situations. So trying to pick up where someone left off, so to speak, it's really hard to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think just as I'm hearing you talk about this, empowering parents and thinking about what are the things that maybe you don't realize you are helping them build life skills, right? You take them with you to the grocery store and maybe you teach them how to find the milk with the expiration date that's the farthest out or something, right? It's a really small thing, but it's part of people's everyday life. And so I think there's probably a lot of foster parents that are, to your point, doing more in the day to day than they think they're doing or giving themselves credit for. And are those the same things that, to your point, are on the checklists that live within the system?
Absolutely.
Taylor, you've expanded your efforts in this area since joining the faculty at the University of Kentucky College of Social Work. Can you tell us what you've been working on lately?
I have a couple different projects I've been working on. So, some work that came out of my dissertation I've been exploring is the burnout and secondary traumatic stress with foster parents. We found in a manuscript forthcoming that social support and parenting stress are significant predictors for both burnout and secondary traumatic stress. So, I'm excited to continue exploring that and exploring how we can mitigate some of those burnout and secondary traumatic stress symptoms by boosting social supports and decreasing parenting stress. I'm currently working on evaluating a program here at the College of Social Work at the University of Kentucky, and it's on foster parent mentorship, where we match seasoned foster parents with new foster parents. So I'm really excited about that program. I also am working on two projects that highlight my overarching research agenda of positive outcomes for youth in out-of-home care. And both of these studies are actually funded by the Institute. So the first project is trauma treatment intervention for youth in foster care. And so we are working with some community partners in Florida to provide group therapy treatment for youth in residential care. And we are currently implementing that intervention now and are excited to see the outcomes of that. This is the second study on this intervention. The first study we did was a small scale pilot, and now we are expanding that, including a greater number of youth. And so we are excited to see the outcomes of that study. The second study that I'm working on is exploring social support needs for youth aging out of foster care, which really hits home with the conversations that you were just having. So, this study, we are doing a mixed method study that is looking at how trauma symptoms are associated with resiliency factors, but then how social support maybe mediates those trauma symptoms and resiliency factors. And then taking a step above that and doing some qualitative work, interviewing young adults who are aging out of care or who recently transitioned from care, and asking them to discuss their experiences with aging out, as well as then depict through photo voice what they wish people knew about their needs as they were transitioning from foster care. And this has been just a really exciting opportunity because I get to meet and talk with these young adults who have transitioned out of care and hear their stories and hear their experiences and really put their words at the forefront of this study and understand their needs. So I've just been very excited about the opportunity to be able to do that.
Thank you so much. And I think the projects that you're working on really, like you said, fall in line with what Vivian and I were just talking about. Again, I hear a lot about mentorship. We see a need for mentorship for youth. We see a need for mentorship for parents. We see a need for mentorship among foster parents, right? So there's this idea that the needs are, they may look different in day-to-day practice, but the need is still there, right? I want to go back to what Vivian said in the beginning. This isn't a typical experience or perhaps a normal experience for a lot of people. So to navigate everything there is to navigate, mentorship certainly seems like it's a key across individuals and certainly foster parents included. I mentioned earlier, I wanted to circle back to the workforce conversation. So, in the past several years, as the Institute has focused heavily on our worker related mandates, we've tried to ensure we're continuing to contribute support to other areas of child welfare. So, namely with youth and parents and caregivers, as we've been discussing today. So, when it comes to foster parents in particular, I've noticed anecdotally that some identify as members of the workforce while others do not. And this has been a really important part of our conversations internally as we develop programming at the Institute. And I'm curious if either of you have thoughts on this.
I'm interested to see what Vivian has to say since she has experience being a foster parent. But this is actually a conversation that I've had many of times in wrestling with this idea that foster parents are so involved in the system. And so it does feel like work because they have checklists of things that they have to do. Unlike parenting, we're not necessarily having a checklist. We don't have to keep documentation that our kid went to the doctor. We don't have to do the tasks, the things that the system asks foster parents to do. But at the same time, as a working mom, I work during the day and sometimes I'll work in the evening, but I can set that aside and then I can focus on what's going on in my home. And foster parents, that is what's going on in their home. They're being a parent to youth who are in the system. And so to me, it doesn't really fit with this idea that they are a part of the workforce. And in looking at theories on workforce, the theories don't really fit either. And so that is something that I've wrestled with for a couple of years in understanding, like, are foster parents a part of the workforce or is this something different? And for me, it doesn't fit with foster parents being a part of the workforce. But I'm interested to see, Vivian, your thoughts on this.
This was really an interesting question to think about because I've heard similarly, speaking with other foster parents, like we are part of the team. And I think that's the biggest piece, right? Is that without kind of having that title or naming it like we are part of the workforce, then I think that oftentimes foster parents are left out of decision making, right? So without that title, it's almost like, well, we're just quote unquote parents. And I think we've seen societal wise that parenting is work, right? And I think we take that for granted, right? Kind of Taylor, like you were saying, you're working parents. And so you work during the day, you come home and you are with your family, but then you also work, you could work later. But that time with your family is not to negate the fact that there are things you're doing that we would consider work, right? And we just don't name it that. And so the biggest piece, I think, as a former foster parent is whether or not we title it as we are part of the workforce, just not being left out of the conversations and the decisions, right? These parents are the individuals that are up at night, if a child's sick at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're the ones answering the door at 11 p.m. with a brand new kid at the door that is so scared and you need to get them into bed and into the process, right? We spend the time with these children, but then oftentimes what we know, our experts in this area with the child is left off the table, right? Because it's just the caregiver. And so I think that's, to me, more of the language I would like to see, is that foster parents need to be at the table. They need to be part of the decision-making process. And I don't know if it means titling that they are part of this workforce, because I agree, Taylor. I don't think it fits in the sense that the definition of workforce, because then are we taking away the fact that they're supposed to be normalizing parenting children they didn't birth? It's a fine line in language, but however we name it is ensuring that foster parents are part of decision-making, part of conversations, understanding that they know the child and potentially the parents much more intimately than other members of the workforce does.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a really good point, Vivian, about the nuance of language. And this is me coming from my partner violence background, right? But in working with victims and survivors of partner violence, for example, oftentimes we let them self-identify. Some people feel very strongly identifying with the term victim, others survivor, others maybe something else entirely. And so I think when we start getting into semantics, it is really interesting to think of like, whose voices are we honoring? And is that more important than the work that we're tasking them to do? Because as Taylor said, as you have said, parenting in any capacity is work. Just raises a lot of research questions for me. As we're talking about this, I'm thinking, well, gosh, I wonder if that would look different for kinship caregivers versus non-kinship caregivers. I wonder if we would see different outcomes among youth who are placed with parents who view themselves as part of the workforce versus foster parents who view themselves as parents, right? I think more questions than answers, which is usually how our conversations go in research. But again, hopefully we can continue to look forward and scratch the surface of these questions a bit more. But I appreciate both of your takes on that particular question. Lastly, I'd just like to ask you both, what is one thing that you would implement today to better support foster parents? If you had your magic wand, what would you do today?
This is such an interesting question because a recent publication of mine found that social service satisfaction predicted turnover. And so that included communication and social service agency support. So basically, really going back to what Vivian said, they want to be a part of the team. Foster parents want their voice heard and they want to be able to make decisions. And so for me, in order to support foster parents, what I would like to see is a dyadic training with caseworkers and foster parents that really helps caseworkers understand how to facilitate engagement with foster parents and how to bring them to the table and how to help include them in some of that decision making. And then also for foster parents, how to get more involved and what does that look like? As Vivian was saying, what is the court process? What can I do at court? How can I show up to court? Things of that nature. And if I really had like a pie in the sky hope, it would be a triadic training that would also include natural families, where we could really see this triad of support where natural parents could rely on foster parents and the social workers, and foster parents could also rely on those natural parents for support, because the natural parents know everything about their child. So they know their favorite foods and their favorite toys. And so if a foster parent could reach out to the parent and say, hey, so and so is having a really difficult night. Is there something that you would do to help them? And if then the parent could say, oh, they love a nightlight, how much more support that foster parent would feel, but then how much better that natural parent would feel that they're still included in this process.
Taylor just took the answer right out of my mouth. And, Lisa knows that parent engagement is definitely the heart of why I went back to school and for my research. So I absolutely agree. I believe that the best, if I were to, you know, be able to select something, would be some sort of sit down at a table where all the parties, birth families, foster families, the system, all sit down and have real conversations about what is going on with the child, right? Because our goal is the well-being and permanency of children. That's the ultimate goal. And I think often we get caught in these disagreements about who's doing what and what's happening. And even though everybody's goal is to make sure that this child is safe, And I think if we get everyone at the table to hear that, I just want my child to be safe, and foster parent, I just want the child to be safe in the system. That's what everybody is saying. Everyone is shouting that, but we're not hearing that from everybody, right? And so if we can get everybody at the table and everyone can be heard, I think we really can smooth out some of the issues much more quickly.
I appreciate that. It reminds me a lot of this idea of social connectedness. And I know that's one of the critical pathways for sort of disentangling what it looks like to have families separated from removal. And so I'm going to be talking about that concept actually in an upcoming episode with Luke Waldo and Claire Anderson. So I appreciate you setting us up so nicely for that conversation. Thank you again, Dr. Dowdy Hazlett and Dr. Mills, for joining us today and offering your perspective on foster parents and the relationship between foster parents and other folks within the child welfare system.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'd like to thank all of our guests for sharing their knowledge and experiences with us today. If you're interested in learning more about this episode and our guests, please visit our website at www.ficw.fsu.edu. You can also follow the Institute on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn at FSU Child Welfare. Thank you to our Director of Communications, Emily Joyce, our producers, David Heller, Brantley Jones, and Alina Bachman, and our audio engineer and editor, Izzy Kring. Finally, thanks to all of you for tuning in today. I'm Dr. Lisa Magruder for the Florida Institute for Child Welfare.